Hello everyone, and welcome to the final video in the full set limited review of Amonkhet. I'm Nitzahon, and all this week I've been doing all the other cards in Amonkhet, the colored cards, and now we're looking at all the cards that aren't monocolored. This isn't the end of my limited review in general, as I will still be putting together an archetype guide in the near future, but in this video I will discuss the only cards that I haven't discussed this week: multicolored cards, artifacts, and lands. Before we get started, here's a quick refresher on how I grade the cards in this review. If you've seen this on another video, you can skip it by going to a timestamp in the description below that will take you to the first card in the video. I'm going to be using letter grades in this limited review. That is what the overwhelming majority of people voted for in a Twitter poll that I conducted. If you'd like to see a different method, let me know in the comments below. Anyway, let's go through each of these letter grades, and for each of them I'll give some examples from Colorless block that I would have given these grades. So as you may have expected, A is the best grade that a card can get. Well, A+ is actually, but those are few and far between. A's are cards that are so powerful that they completely shift a game in your favor, almost regardless of the board state. They are also so strong that they pull you into their colors and tempt you to find a way to splash them. They are most frequently made up of rares and mythics, though the occasional uncommon does find its way in there. Some examples of this from Kaladesh block would be cards like Herald of Anguish and Verdurous Gearhulk. These are basically the cards that you most want to open and pick in your first pack because they give your deck such a massive power boost. Next up, we have cards that receive a B. These are still great cards, but not quite as game-warping as A-level cards. This category is made up of cards that should basically always be making the cut in your deck if they're in your color. This includes premium removal and extremely efficient and powerful creatures. Cards at this grade level don't tempt you to change your entire draft the way A-level cards do, but they make the cut 100% of the time in your deck if you're in their colors. Most frequently, these are of uncommon rarity or higher, though sometimes commons get in the mix. Some examples of this from Kaladesh block are Thopter Arrest and Scrapper Champion. Next, there are C-level cards. While A's and B's are the kind of cards you're happy to first pick, C's aren't quite as exciting. They're the kind of card that basically always makes your deck if they're in your color, but aren't incredibly powerful. Here is where you find solid and efficient creatures as well as decent removal, and this is usually what the majority of your deck is actually made up of. Some examples of C-level cards from Kaladesh block are cards like Ether Swooper and Shock. Basically, these are all cards you feel good about having in your deck, but not great about taking super early. So in an ideal world, your deck will be made up entirely of cards in the A through C range. That's something to keep in mind in general as I go through cards in this list and in the other limited review videos. Cards in the D and F range are not cards you generally want in your deck. However, D cards aren't entirely terrible, but they're cards that frequently get cut from your deck and are basically just filler to help you with your curve. Generally, things have to go a little bit wrong during your draft for you to end up with more than a few D cards in your deck, as you are stretching to include every playable card you drafted if they're showing up there. Some examples of this are Ether Inspector and Reservoir Walker. Both of these cards are cards I ended up playing a few times in the format, but I was never very happy to have to do it. Generally, most decks are made up of B's and C's because A's are so rare and D's are mediocre playables that will sometimes make the cut. However, there is a grade even worse than D, obviously, and that is F. These are cards that I consider utterly unplayable and shouldn't end up in your deck for any reason. These are the cards that always seem to be the last cards you pick up in booster packs. Some recent examples of this would be Gonti's Machinations and Take Into Custody. A few more words on grading. There's some more nuance to it in many cases. I will give some cards a grade range instead of just a single letter grade because some cards are stone unplayable in some decks but become very good if your deck meets certain requirements. A good example of this from Ether Revolt is Efficient Construction. This card just gets a straight F if you have less than 5 artifacts, but if you get to 10 or more, it suddenly becomes a B. These type of nuances show up from time to time while grading cards, and I will draw your attention to them when we run into cards like it. There are also cards that aren't very good main board, but are pretty good out of the sideboard. For these cards, I will give grades based on how good I think the card would be in my main board, but also a sideboard grade that reflects how happy I am to have that card available out of my sideboard. A good example of this is Takedown, which is a D main board, but a B out of your sideboard. Just a quick note about the gold cards before we get to talking about them. They are multicolored, and my grade for all of them will be based on the assumption that you are playing both colors, and cards don't receive a penalty here for being gold, though it should be kept in mind that first picking gold cards can be dangerous since you can never be sure what colors will be open, but I will make specific mention when I think a gold card is actually first pickable. There are a few in this set. This set also comes with an interesting type of multicolored card, the ones with Aftermath. For those, I will be giving 2 grades, one based on only being able to cast the non-Aftermath half of the card, and one based on being able to cast both halves. Now let's get started with the multicolored cards. The first one is On-Crop Champion, which for 2 generic, 1 green, and 1 white is a 4/4 human warrior, and it says you may exert On-Crop Champion as it attacks. When you do, untap all other creatures you control. This is the signpost common for green-white, and because of that, it synergizes super well with the exert mechanic, which is very prevalent in those two colors. It has exert itself, and when it exerts itself, it untaps all of your other creatures. That means that your creatures with exert all get to become untapped if you have a bunch of them, and you can use your exert effect again next turn. All of that on top of the fact that the champion is a 4 mana 4/4, which means it gets a B for me. If you're in green-white, you'll play this all day, and if it's clear you're in those colors and they are open, you should take it, even relatively early. Next is Aven Wind Guide, which for 2 generic, 1 white, and 1 blue is a 2/3 bird warrior with flying and vigilance, and it says creature tokens you control have flying and vigilance, and it has Embalm for 4 generic, 1 white, and 1 blue. Embalm is a new mechanic in this set that lets you exile the card from the graveyard for a cost, and you get a tokened copy that also happens to be a zombie and white into play. Aven Wind Guide is the signpost uncommon for blue-white, which is the color pair with the most Embalm, so naturally it supports deck with tons of creature tokens, and it itself has Embalm. 4 mana for a 2/3 with flying and vigilance is a great rate, and I would already play that card. Giving all your creature tokens those same 2 keywords is awesome, and on top of that, as I mentioned, this bird has Embalm, so it can come back from your graveyard, giving you some nice late-game value. This is another B. If you want this in basically every blue-white deck, even in those with 0 tokens, it's a fine card, and chances are you have more than 0 if you're in blue-white. Next, we have Bounty of the Luxa, which is 2 generic, 1 green, and 1 blue for an enchantment that says, at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, remove all flood counters from Bounty of the Luxa. If no counters are removed this way, put a flood counter on Bounty of the Luxa and draw a card. Otherwise, add colorless, green, and blue to your mana pool. This card has a weird design, so to put it simply, it alternates between drawing you a card and giving you 3 extra mana every turn. Both of these are pretty beneficial, especially because this set seems loaded with mana sinks, and because of that, I think Bounty of the Luxa is a great card that can grind you out some wins. That said, it has a downside that mini-engine cards have. The turn you cast it, it does nothing to develop your board, and that's pretty dangerous against more aggressive decks. However, the upside in Bounty of the Luxa is so great that you can cast it. You want to cast it in basically every deck you can. Ramping into bigger creatures, having more mana for mana sinks, and drawing more cards is some pretty serious value, and it gets a B+ for me, and I think is even worth thinking about first picking sometimes, despite the risk of being gold. Next, we have Decimator Beetle, which for 3 generic, 1 black, and 1 green is a 4/5 insect, and it says, when Decimator Beetle enters the battlefield, put a -1/-1 counter on target creature you control. When Decimator Beetle attacks, remove a -1/-1 counter from target creature you control and put a -1/-1 counter on up to 1 target creature defending player controls. This is the signpost common for black-green. The color pair most focused on -1/-1 counters, so it makes sense that it does stuff with them. Like a lot of cards in that color pair, the Beetle offers you options and flexibility when you first play it. You can put the -1/-1 counter on it to have it be a 3/4, or you can put it on another creature to make him a 4/5. Fact is, even if you put the counter on him, he can remove it and put it on one of your opponent's creatures, making himself a 4/5 anyway, so a lot of the time it won't matter where you put that counter. I don't think the Beetle is quite as good as the other signpost uncommons we've looked at so far, though, because its fail case, while fine, isn't as good as the first 2 signpost uncommons we looked at. If your deck didn't get a reasonable number of -1/-1 counters, or if you just have this guy in play on his own, he is a 5 mana 4/5 who gives something a -1/-1 counter the first time it attacks. That's fine, but not incredible. Most black-green decks will want this card, but because his floor is sort of low, I'm only going to give him a C+. Next, we have Enigma Drake, which is 1 generic, 1 blue, and 1 red for a star 4 Drake with flying, and it says Enigma's Drake's power is equal to the number of instant and sorcery cards in your graveyard. This is a signpost uncommon for the blue-red archetype, which focuses on casting instants and sorceries. If you have a deck with 10 or more instants and sorceries, which you want to be doing in this color pair, ideally at least, the Enigma Drake is quite the creature. It wouldn't be that hard to at least come in as a 2/4. If you have 5 or less instants and sorceries, though, it's pretty mediocre. That said, not even all blue-red decks will get enough instants and sorceries for this to be the card you want, so I think it only gets a C+. Most blue-red decks will want it, but not even all of them. Next, we have Hapatra, Vizier of Poisons, who is 1 black and 1 green for a 2/2 human cleric. Whenever Hapatra, Vizier of Poisons deals combat damage to a player, you may put a -1/-1 counter on target creature. Whenever you put 1 or more -1/-1 counters on a creature, create a 1/1 green snake creature token with Death Touch. Hapatra is a lot of fun. It's a 2-mana 2/2 with -1/-1 counter synergies, and the color pair it is in is completely loaded with -1/-1 counter creatures. Even on its own, Hapatra gets to put a -1/-1 counter on a creature anytime she gets in for combat damage, which results in the creation of a 1/1 token that also happens to have Death Touch. If you've ever played against tokens with Death Touch, you don't need me to tell you how stupid powerful they can be. Getting a free card that can trade with anything is great. Every black-green deck will play this card because at worst it's a 2-mana 2/2 with upside, and in most cases it will be pretty difficult for your deck not to have other sources of counters. Hapatra gets a B+ from me, and I personally hope I can draft her in a super synergistic black-green deck in this format. Next we have Honored Crop Captain, which for 1 red and 1 white is a 3/2 human warrior, and it says whenever Honored Crop Captain attacks, other attacking creatures get +1/+0 until end of turn. This is the signpost common for red-white, and it asks that you play a creature-heavy, low-curve deck that can go wide on the opponent. A 2-mana 3/2 with upside is nice, and the upside here is fairly significant. Giving your whole team +1/+0 when it attacks is pretty nice. I'm going to give this a B-. While every red-white deck will want this card, I don't think it's quite as impressive in terms of raw power level as some of the other signpost uncommons. Next, we have Kenra Charioteer, which is 1 generic mana, 1 red mana, and 1 green mana for a 3/3 Jackal Warrior with Trample, and other creatures you control have Trample. This is the signpost common for red-green, and similar to red-white, it seems to want you to be playing an aggro deck. Though in this case, it is asking you to play some larger creatures, because putting Trample on smaller creatures isn't going to be as good. This thing is a failed case of being a 3-mana 3/3 with Trample, and that's pretty solid. Every red-green deck wants this guy, and I'm going to give him a B-. Next, we have Merciless Javelineer, which is 2 generic, 1 black, and 1 red for a 4/2 Minotaur Warrior. It has an activated ability where you pay 2 mana and discard a card to put a -1/-1 counter on target creature, and that creature can't block this turn. Merciless Javelineer is the signpost uncommon for black-red, and it shows you that the color pair has a couple of different things going on. Primarily, that color pair focuses on cards with cycling and discarding cards, but it has a small -1/-1 counter sub-theme, so Merciless Javelineer helps you with both of those. Its activated ability is very powerful. It would be if all it did was either of these things, put the -1/-1 counter on something, or make a creature unable to block. But it does both. Still, the Javelineer's ability requires the very real cost of discarding cards and paying some mana. As I noted, this won't be a downside as often in red-black as it is in other colors, since the color pair has several payouts for discarding cards or having 1 or fewer cards in your hand. But you still won't always want to use its ability. The Javelineer is also somewhat fragile with only 2 toughness. Any red-black deck will play it, but its fragility makes it hard for me to give it more than a B-. Next, we have Neheb the Worthy, which is 1 generic mana, 1 black mana, and 1 red mana for a 2/2 legendary creature, Minotaur Warrior. He has First Strike. He gives all other Minotaurs you control First Strike, and as long as you have 1 or fewer cards in your hand, he also gives all your Minotaurs +2/+0, including himself. Whenever Neheb the Worthy deals combat damage to a player, each player discards a card. Worthy is kind of an overstatement for this guy. He isn't terrible. I mean, he's a 3-mana 2/2 with First Strike, which isn't the worst. He also gives your Minotaurs, including himself, as I noted, +2/+0, but only if you can get down to 1 or fewer cards in your hand. He then becomes a 4/2 First Striker, which is pretty nice. Neheb does help you get down to a small number of cards in your hand, since if he hits your opponent, you and your opponent both discard a card, but I don't feel like there are quite enough Minotaurs around to make Neheb all that worthy. Generally, he will just be a 3-mana 2/2 with First Strike, who will sometimes be a 4/2 with First Strike, which isn't bad, but certainly nothing special either. Not all black-red decks should go out of their way for Neheb, but he's a solid playable. You shouldn't hate picking up mid-pack or so, and that gives Neheb a C. Next, we have Nissa, Steward of Elements, which is a Planeswalker Nissa, as you'd expect, with X, green-blue, and she comes into play with X loyalty. Nissa's +2 loyalty ability is Scry 2, simple enough. She has a 0 loyalty ability that says, look at the top card of your library. If it's a land card or a creature card with converted mana cost less than or equal to the number of loyalty counters on Nissa Steward of Elements, you may put that card onto the battlefield. She also has an ultimate that is -6, untap up to 2 target lands you control. They become 5/5 elemental creatures with flying and haste until end of turn. They're still lands. While most gold cards aren't slam first picks, Nissa is. Because she is an X-costed card, her effectiveness scales throughout the game, and that kind of card tends to be pretty powerful, especially when it also happens to be a Planeswalker. You can stick her out there in turn 3, and if your opponent is having a slow start, you can tick her up to 3 loyalty and start to take over the game. If you draw her late, you can play her with 6 loyalty and attack your opponent for 10 in the air right away, and her 0 loyalty ability is also very good, allowing you to put cards into play for free, and it gets better the longer the game goes on. So yeah, Nissa's gold, but you should first pick her and do everything you can to play her, within reason of course. If you aren't playing either of these 2 colors, you won't be able to play her, but if you're playing one of them, finding a way to splash her is a good call, and for me, that gives Nissa an A. Next, we have Samet, Voice of Dissent, who for 3 generic, 1 red, and 1 green is a 3/4 human warrior and a legendary creature, and get ready for all this stuff. It has Flash, Double Strike, Vigilance, Haste, and other creatures you control have haste, and you can pay 1 mana to untap another target creature. How many crazy, amazing keyword abilities can you fit onto a single card? Samet is savage and powerful, and another gold card that is worth first picking, despite being gold, and indeed, to get full value out of her, you even have to be playing white, but even without white, she's ridiculous. Flashing in a 3/4 blocker with Double Strike is disgusting and will just end up killing the majority of creatures in the format. Having Vigilance also means you get to reap the rewards of Double Strike on both sides of the card, and while having both Haste and Flash is sort of counterintuitive, having the option to just play Samet and swing for 6 when your opponent doesn't expect it adds extra value to her. But yeah, find a way to play this card and be thrilled to open it. Find a way to splash it if you have to. This means this is another gold card that gets an A. Next, we have Shadowstorm Vizier, which for 1 blue and 1 black is a 1/3 human cleric with flying, and whenever you cycle or discard a card, Shadowstorm Vizier gets +1/+1 until end of turn. This is a signpost common for blue-black, and it pushes you towards playing as many cards with cycling or discard effects as you can, and blue-black is where you can find the most of those effects, so that makes sense. A 2-mana 1/3 flyer is usually already a playable card, but having the additional effect of getting pumped when you cycle things make this card feel almost like a 2-mana 1/3 with prowess. Drafting decks with cards with cycling is just going to happen naturally in this set, especially in this color pair, and because of that, I think Shadowstorm Vizier deserves a solid B. Next, we have Temet, Vizier of Naktamun, which for 1 white and 1 blue is a 2/2 legendary creature, a human cleric, and it has, at the beginning of combat on your turn, target creature token you control gets +1/+1 until end of turn, and can't be blocked this turn. It also has Embalm for 3, a white, and a blue. This card is cool, but it actually leaves me somewhat underwhelmed as far as a card that is here to support the Embalm archetype. A 2-mana 2/2 is what you want, and 1 with upside's pretty good, and the upside here is real. Making any creature token you have unblockable and gain +1/+1 is solid, but it's not incredible. Yes, once you embalm Temet, he comes back as a token himself and becomes a 3-power unblockable creature every turn, but the embalm cost here is pretty steep. It sounds like I'm super down on this card, and I sort of am, but it is still a good 2-drop with legit upside, and I think basically any blue deck would want to play it. I'm just saying you probably don't want to be taking him over premium removal or other powerful creatures, even if you're in blue-white, since the synergy he offers isn't incredible. I'm still willing to give him a B- though. Next, we have Weaver of Currents, which for 1 generic, 1 green, and 1 blue is a 2/2 Naga Druid, and it can tap to add 2 colorless mana to your mana pool. This is the signpost uncommon for blue-green, which seems to focus primarily on ramping into big monsters, and obviously, Weaver of Currents helps you with that. A 3-mana 2/2 isn't what you want, but the ability to ramp you up 2 whole mana is incredible, and can let you play a 6-drop on turn 4. That's strong enough for me to give this card a straight B. Every blue-green deck will want to play it without question and should go after it after it becomes clear that those colors are open. Next, we have Wayward Servant, which for 1 white and 1 black is a 2/2 zombie, and it says whenever another zombie enters the battlefield under your control, each opponent loses 1 life, and you gain 1 life. Wayward Servant is the signpost uncommon for the black-white deck, which is focused on zombies, including cards that themselves are zombies, like the Servant here, and creatures with Embalm. A 2-mana 2/2 is solid, and one that drains your opponent a life every time you play a zombie has some definite upside. Obviously, the Servant gets better the more zombies you can jam into your deck, and gets into the B range when you get 10 or more zombies and or creatures with Embalm, but I think it's probably a C+ in your average black-white deck. So now let's move on to cards with Aftermath that have sides of 2 different colors. As I mentioned earlier, I'm going to be giving each of these cards 2 grades. The first assumes you are only playing the color of the part you can cast from your hand, and the second assumes you can cast both halves of the card. This is because technically you could play all of the cards that have Aftermath without playing both colors on the card. You do basically have to be playing the color on the part you can cast from your hand, though, and I think with some of them that's going to be perfectly reasonable. So the first of these we're going to look at is Start to Finish, which for 2 generic and 1 white is an instant that says create 2 1/1 white warrior creature tokens with Vigilance. The other half is Finish, which has the Aftermath mechanic, which means you can only cast it from your graveyard and then exile the card. And it says, as an additional cost to cast Finish, sacrifice a creature. Destroy target creature. So all of these cards with Aftermath, or at least most of them, have some interesting flexibility. And that's something you can see here. Start is a bad Raise the Alarm, and Raise the Alarm is a solid playable in most limited formats because it's an instant speed way of getting a couple tokens in play, who can sometimes just block and kill things, or at worst can give you 2/1/1s with Flash. If this card was just the start half, I think it would be a C-, a playable but unexciting white card that would barely make the cut most of the time. Adding the Finish half to this card is pretty important though, and makes this card a lot better. So you can cast Start early on in the game, on turn 3 or so, and then later in the game cash in the Finish half to kill something. But you have more options than that. You can cast Start at the end of your opponent's turn on turn 3 and then use Finish on turn 4 to kill a creature. Or if you top deck this in the late game, or hold on to it into the late game, it basically becomes a 6-mana sorcery that says, put a 1/1 white warrior creature token into play with Vigilance and destroy target creature. That's a pretty good removal spell. All in all, if you can cast both sides of this spell and have access to the variety of options I mentioned, Start to Finish becomes a B, a card I would be happy to play in every single black-white deck I draft. Next, we have Reduce to Rubble, which for 2 generic and 1 blue, on the part you can cast from your hand, is an instant and says counter target spell unless its controller pays 3. The Rubble half with Aftermath says up to 3 target lands don't untap during their controller's next untap step. So I'm not a huge fan of this particular card. Reduce is a bad mana leak, and mana leak is an okay but not great card in Limited. I know I mentioned it in my review of blue cards, but I'll say it again here. Counter spells are somewhat problematic in Limited, given that your opponent has to sort of play into them. If someone plays around a card like Reduce, which isn't that difficult to do, you have left up 3 mana for no reason, and that feels terrible. The value of counter spells that aren't hard counters diminishes as the game goes on too, because chances get higher and higher that your opponent will be able to pay 3 mana, making Reduce useless. On its own, I think Reduce is a D+, the kind of card that is alright, but one that I'm hoping I don't have to play most of the time. Now, things get a little complicated with these split cards, but that's a good thing. It's because they are flexible. You can choose to cast Reduce and Rubble in the same turn, which will theoretically lock down the 3 lands your opponent played to pay for Reduce. That's sort of the trick here, I guess, but I don't actually think that's very good. If you can counter a spell and lock down 3 lands on the same turn, then you're really doing something, though. Generally, I think the way things will happen with Reduce to Rubble is that you'll counter a spell in the early part of the game, and in the later part of the game use Rubble to make it so your opponent can't do as much with their turn. This card is also helped by the fact that the blue-red archetype is interested in casting as many instants and sorceries as possible, and this gives you 2 of those on 1 card. I do think if you run both of these colors, the card becomes playable because of the value it can bring because of being 2 cards in 1, but it still doesn't get beyond a C for me, even in a blue-red deck. It's an okay playable, but nothing special. Take them if you see them in the middle of the pack, and it is clear you are blue-red, otherwise Reduced to Rubble isn't so good. Next, we have Destined to Lead, which for 1 colorless and 1 black on the half you can cast from your hand is Destined, and it's an instant, and it says target creature gets +1/+0 and gains Indestructible until end of turn. The lead half is 3 generic and 1 green for a sorcery. This is the Aftermath half, and it says all creatures able to block target creature this turn do so. The Destined half of this card is a playable combat trick we have seen versions of before. A power boost and Indestructible is a decent way to make sure your creature survives combat and kills another one. It isn't incredible since it only boosts power by 1, but it's not bad either. It also gets bonus points for being usable in a pinch as a way of keeping removal from killing your creature. Though, keep in mind that -1/-1 effects will still kill your creature if you use this. I thought that was worth mentioning in a set that was loaded with -1/-1 counters. On its own, Destined is about a C-, a combat trick I will run from time to time, but not always. The lead half is where things get sort of interesting. Like all of the cards with Aftermath, the 2 cards can usually be cast together in a synergistic way, and that's the case here. If you use Destined and Lead in the same turn, you can make a creature indestructible and force all of your opponent's creatures to block it. Sometimes this will be pretty devastating, as if your creature is big enough you can take down a lot of your opponent's creatures, and it means your other attackers will get through unblocked. So that's a pretty good way to use this card in the late game. It also has the flexibility to be used in the early game as a combat trick, the Destined half, and in the late game to get lethal damage through on your opponent when you make all of their creatures block your smallest guy. If you are playing both of the colors on this card, it gets pushed all the way up to a C+, a card most black-green decks will be happy to play, but still not something incredible. Next, we have Onward to Victory, which is 2 generic and 1 red on the Onward half that you can cast from your hand. It's an instant, and it says target creature gets +X/+0 until end of turn, where X is its power. The victory half, which is the aftermath half, has 2 generic and 1 white, and it's a sorcery, and it says, target creature gains double strike until end of turn. The onward half of this card is bad. Generally, for a combat trick to be good and limited, it has to have a way to help the creature you are using it on survive while also killing your opponent's creature. Onward doesn't do that, because it only pumps the power of the creature. The idea here, I guess, is to get in for a bunch of damage on your opponent with it, but your creatures going unblocked usually isn't going to be a guarantee, and making a 3-3 into a 6-3 for a turn is hardly worth a card. Onward on its own is an unplayable card that I would give an F to. The victory half makes things a little more interesting. Now, you can pump your creature and give it double strike if you cast both in the same turn, but that's a pretty steep cost at 6 mana. What's more is victory is a sorcery, so if you do that, your opponent knows it is coming and will just block. If you have a deck with a ton of creatures with flying, this might be good, but even with the victory half being castable in your deck, I think this card maxes out in the D range. It is a pity that the red-white card in the cycle is so bad, because most of the other cards in this cycle are at least Cs, and so it kind of sucks for red-white that they get an F and a D. Next, we have Spring to Mind, which for 2 generic and 1 green, the part you can cast from your hand, is a sorcery, and it says search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle your library. The other half is Mind, which is 4 blue, 4 colorless, and 2 blue, and it's an instant. This is the aftermath half, and it says draw 2 cards. So the spring half of this card is a strictly worse version of Rampant Growth, but it does provide your deck some much needed fixing, and ramping is something that green decks will be interested in too. On its own, I only give Spring a D+. There are better sources of fixing in this format than Spring, but if you end up picking up an off-color bomb or a premium removal spell and you were desperate for fixing, you would play Spring even if you could only cast that half of this card. Spring to Mind isn't quite as synergistic between its 2 halves as most of the cards we've discussed here. In fact, casting the 2 sides together doesn't really do anything special for you. Basically, Mind is just some extra value out of your graveyard in the late game. Having Mind in your back pocket, or your graveyard, I guess, is a nice thing to have, since you can cash it in for 2 cards whenever you need it. And don't forget that it's an instant, even though it's in your graveyard. So it gives you a very good late game way to spend your extra mana when you are flooding out. 6 mana for 2 cards isn't the greatest rate, but keep in mind you aren't actually spending a card when you cast Mind either, since you're using a card in your graveyard and not in your hand. Spring to Mind becomes a C+ when you can cast both halves, thanks to the extra value that Mind brings in the late game. Next, we have Prepare to Fight, which for 1 generic and 1 white, on the part you can cast from your hand, is Prepare. It's an instant, and it says untap target creature. It gets +2/+2 and gains lifelink until end of turn. The Fight half is 3 generic and 1 green. It's a sorcery, with its aftermath half, and it says target creature you control fights target creature in opponent controls. The Prepare half of this card is a good combat trick. +2/+2 for 2 mana is usually an okay combat trick, but this comes with the added bonuses of lifelink and untapping your creature, meaning you can sometimes use it defensively, and the untap is also useful in creatures with Exert, which green-white has a lot of. That boost is sufficient enough to help you break through problem blockers or kill problem attackers. On its own, Prepare is a C+ level combat trick, one any aggressive white deck would be happy to have. If you can cast both halves of this card, though, then you're really getting there. If you want to cast both halves in 1 turn, that's not too bad. Paying 6 mana to kill something and gain some life. But I think you will get the most value out of this card by making sure that each half of it claims one of your opponent's creatures, giving you a 2-for-1. This means using the Prepare half as a trick, and then later using Fight to kill something else. You won't always be able to do that, but that is an option you have. A good combat trick plus a fight spell in 1 card is good, and I think any green-white deck would be happy to have this card and maybe even take it early, which is a solid B from me. Next, we have Failure to Comply, which is 1 generic and 1 blue on the part you can cast from your hand. It's an instant and says, return target spell to its owner's hand. The Comply half is 1 white, and it says, choose a card name. Until your next turn, your opponent can't cast spells with the chosen name. We have had a similar card in a limited format recently, Unsubstantiate. It could return creatures to its owner's hands too, though, so that made it substantially better. Just being able to bounce a spell isn't that great. Sure, it really pays off in a situation where your opponent tapped 5+ mana for something, but you're really just slowing them down a little bit, which isn't bad, but you also aren't trading a card for their card. You're losing a card while they keep one, and in the long run, that's not so good. I really don't recommend playing just a failure half of this card, and I have it as, ironically, since it's called Failure, an F. Adding Comply to the mix is pretty interesting, though, as it slows down your opponent even more, at least it does ideally. The problem is, if the spell you bounce doesn't stay in your opponent's hand until your turn, the Comply half is going to be pretty bad once you lose the information about the card in your opponent's hand, so this card can be a complete and utter dud unless you cast it in the optimal situation, which will probably be less than 50% of the time. Because of that, even if you cast both halves of this card, you shouldn't. This card is an F. Next, we have Rags to Riches, which for 2 generic and 2 black on the part you can cast from your hand, which is Rags, says all creatures get -2/-2 until end of turn. The Riches half for 4 generic and 2 blue is a sorcery. This is the Aftermath half, and it says each opponent chooses a creature he or she controls. You gain control of those creatures. Rags is clearly going to be at its best in a control deck that doesn't have a lot of its own small creatures and will be a pretty nice card there, where it can do a good job killing a significant portion of your opponent's creatures. Still, -2/-2 to all creatures at sorcery speed is something we've seen before, and it hasn't exactly been incredible, and with just a Rags half of this card, it's a C. The sort of ideal thing to do is to cast Rags and get rid of all your opponent's small creatures, and then if you were playing both colors, to play Riches. Problem is, that's not going to happen very often, at least not on the same turn, because that takes a whopping 11 mana. This will happen sometimes, and this will be a pretty nice top deck in the super late game when you have that much mana, but it isn't going to be common. Riches mostly just offers you some minor late game value out of your graveyard, but on its own is a pretty bad card since paying 7 to get your opponent's worst creature is bad. Still, it does make the card moderately better to be able to do something in the late game and the early game, so I think it gets pushed up to a C+ if you're playing both colors. Next, we have Cut to Ribbons, which on its half you can cast from your hand is Cut, and it's 1 generic and 1 red for a sorcery, and it says Cut deals 4 damage to target creature. The Ribbons half, which has Aftermath, is X and 2 black mana, and it says each opponent loses X life. Cut to Ribbons is my pick for the best one of these Aftermath cards in both Constructed and Limited. If you can only play the cut half, you have a very good card, probably a solid B, as it makes for a very efficient removal where you almost always be trading up. Even if you're only playing red, this is worth an early pick. The Ribbons half of this card would actually be pretty bad as a standalone card since it can't hit creatures at all, and thus doesn't affect the board on its own, but I like it a lot here as some extra value out of the graveyard. In the early game, you kill something with cut, and in the late game, you can use Ribbons to finish off your opponent. If you can cast both cards of this card, halves of this card, I think it's a B+, meaning this card is worth a first pick. Next, we have Heaven to Earth, which is X and a green on the Heaven half, which you can cast from your hand, and an instant, and it says Heaven deals X damage to each creature with flying. The Earth half, which is the Aftermath half, is X and 2 red mana for Earth deals X damage to each creature without flying. Just the Heaven half of this card is probably mostly a sideboard card. Though there are enough creatures with flying around, playing it main board isn't completely terrible, especially because it's a rare example of an instant that can hit the whole board. If you can just cast Heaven, it is probably in the D range in the main board, but a C+ out of the sideboard. The Earth half is where the action is, though, as Earthquaking the whole board is generally a pretty strong effect and limited. An interesting thing you can do here sometimes is just pay 1 green to get Earth into your graveyard at the end of your opponent's turn, and then cast Earth for huge damage out of your graveyard in your turn. I think this will be a common way of playing the card in situations where the opponent has no flyers. If you can cast the Earth half, it gets into the B range and is worth mainboarding, and if you can cast that half, you've got a pretty great card, and it's first pickable, I think. Now we move into artifacts. The first of these is Bantu's Monument. It's part of a cycle of monuments that we will discuss in this video that are all legendary and all represent one of the gods from Amonkhet, reducing the casting costs of creatures of their color and doing something whenever you cast creature spells of that color. Bantu's Monument is a pretty decent one. Adding Drain 1 life to every creature you play, that is black anyway, isn't the best effect ever if that's all it did, but also reducing the mana cost of your black creatures makes this a reasonable playable in a deck with a solid number of black creatures. I will say that these monuments are kind of awkward in a world where you have to play 2 color limited decks because you could end up in situations where your hand is filled with creatures of the other color in your deck, and the monuments never really reduce any cost. I think Bantu's Monument is a C. If you're heavy into black and have 15 or more creatures in general, it is going to be worth running in your deck, but it isn't going to be incredible or anything. Next, we have Edifice of Authority, which for 3 generic mana is an artifact, and for 1 and tapping it, you can have target creature be unable to attack this turn, and you put a brick counter on Edifice of Authority. It also has a second activated ability, where you can pay 1 and tap it for a different ability, and that's until your next turn, target creature can't attack or block, and its activated abilities can't be activated. Activate this ability only if there are 3 or more brick counters on Edifice of Authority. This is my pick for the best Amonkhet artifact in Limited of any rarity. Keeping a creature from attacking for 1 mana isn't amazing, but once you do it a few times and get up to 3 counters, this is able to stop attacking or blocking for a long time. Your opponent won't be able to block in your turn, and they won't be able to attack on their turn, and that is insanely good. It does take a total investment of 6 mana to get there in most cases, but it is spread out in reasonable enough installments that this is a reasonably powerful artifact that can really wreak havoc on your opponent's board. The fact it takes some time to set up keeps me from wanting to say it is first pickable a lot of the time, but it will be sometimes, and I'm going to give it a B-. Next, we have Embalmer's Tools, which for 2 generic mana is an artifact, and it says, activated abilities of creature cards in your graveyard cost 1 less to activate. It also has, tap an untapped zombie you control. Target player puts the top card of his or her library into his or her graveyard. Here the idea is that your deck is all about Embalm. Reducing your Embalm cost by 1 isn't bad, and in a grindy matchup, being able to mill your opponent out with your Embalm zombies isn't terrible either. That said, I'm not sure just how much Embalm you have to make this worth playing, but I think it has to be quite a bit, not the amount you want to pick up in a typical draft. This card is a good sideboard card for any zombie-heavy deck, though, because, as I mentioned, it offers a way out of board stalls because you can just try to mill your opponent out. That said, milling can be dangerous in a format with Aftermath and Embalm, so winning that way isn't exactly ideal, as you may just end up giving your opponent more gas that allows them to kill you before you can mill them out. Overall, I think this card is a D. I won't be playing it most of the time, and I don't think you should be either, since neither thing it does is overly powerful and asks a little bit too much of you. Next, we have Gate to the Afterlife, which for 3 generic mana is an artifact, and it says, whenever a non-token creature you control dies, you gain 1 life. Then you may draw a card. If you do, discard a card. It also has pay 2 generic mana and tap it, sacrifice Gate to the Afterlife, search your graveyard, hand, and or library for a card named God Pharaoh's Gift and put it onto the battlefield. If you search your library this way, shuffle it. Activate this ability only if there are 6 or more creature cards in your graveyard. Obviously, we don't yet have access to God Pharaoh's Gift, so that part of the card is irrelevant. It may become more relevant once Hour of Devastation comes out, though. In fact, it almost definitely will. But for now, we only care about the first half of Gate to the Afterlife, and it does some nice things when you have a creature die. Gaining you 1 life and letting you loot is pretty solid. However, the fact that it says non-token is very relevant because there are tons of tokens in this set in the form of embalmed creatures especially, but there's more tokens than even just them. Since you don't get the bonus when they die, that significantly weakens the card in these embalm-heavy decks. I think once you've looted 3 times off this, you feel like the 3-mana investment was reasonable, and in a deck with 15 or more creatures, that shouldn't be too difficult to pull off. Also, don't forget the fact that looting involves discarding a card, and that means you can activate triggers on cards that care about cycling and discarding cards. However, this is still a 3-mana card that doesn't affect the board at all, and it never does. It just helps you draw some action. This card is a C- for me. I'm only going to play it in a deck that has tons of cycling synergy and avoid it in most other decks. Next, we have Hazaret's Monument, which for 3 generic mana is a legendary artifact that says red creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. It also has whenever you cast a creature spell, you may discard a card. If you do, draw a card. So we went from a card that helps you loot to one that helps you rummage. Hazaret's Monument gets a little bit of a boost from the fact that red-based decks are very frequently going to be creature-based, but it is also worth noting that Hazaret's Monument is kind of an awkward card for an aggro deck to play, since you probably want to be playing a creature on turn 3 instead of this thing. That said, rummaging is a good effect in the late game when you're trying to get rid of all your excess lands and draw some gas. It can also trigger cards that look for players to discard or cycle cards. Still, I think the Monument is weaker than Bantu's, and I'm going to give it a C-. You'll play in a heavy red deck or in a deck with lots of discard synergies, but in aggro versions of the deck, it is a bit awkward. Next, we have Honed Khopesh, which for 1 mana is an artifact equipment, the only equipment in the whole set, incidentally, and it says equipped creature gets +1/+1 and it has an equip of 1 mana. This is a functional reprint of Leonin's Scimitar, one of the first pieces of equipment printed back in Mirrodin, and Leonin's Scimitar was pretty good. I think this will be too, as the investment it asked for you is relatively small. Equipment can get pretty bad when it has high equip cost because your opponent can really disrupt your tempo by interacting with the creature you're trying to equip. Here, you were just using 1 mana, and you're not going to be hurting too much if they do that. The bonus it gives is very reasonable for the mana cost, too. This is a card you want in any deck in the format that has 15 or more creatures in it, and because of that, I'm going to give it a C+. You don't want to take it super early, but I don't hate taking it around pick 6 or 7. Next, we have Kefnet's Monument, which for 3 generic mana is a legendary artifact, and it says, blue creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. And it says, whenever you cast a creature spell, target creature an opponent controls doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. I don't like this Monument a ton. Locking down creatures is nice, but the fact that the creature already has to be tapped to make it actually do anything makes it worse than most effects like this. Additionally, this sort of effect is inherently weaker in a set that has Exert, as sometimes creatures won't be untapping anyway. Sure, you can play a creature the next turn and keep the Exerter tapped down for another turn, but having to hold off on playing a creature just to do that is a very real opportunity cost. Kefnet's Monument is a C- for me. It'll be okay in a deck with a lot of blue creatures, but nothing special. Next, we have Luxa River Shrine, which is 3 generic mana for an artifact. You can pay 1 and tap it, and gain 1 life, and put a brick counter on Luxa River Shrine. So we have brick counters again here. And it also has an ability where you can just tap it and pay no mana, and it says you gain 2 life. Activate this ability only if there are 3 or more brick counters on Lux or River Shrine. I'm not a fan of life gain for the sake of life gain, and while this is a repeatable source of it, I don't think it does enough. After an investment of 5 mana and gaining 2 life, you gain 2 life a turn with it. And if when it comes into play, it could gain you 2 life a turn right away, it would probably be a solid playable, but that's not what it does. As it stands, requiring you to accumulate a couple of brick counters, I think this card is in the D range, and I hope not to play it very frequently. Next, we have Oketra's Monument, which for 3 generic is a legendary artifact, and it says white creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. It also says whenever you cast a creature spell, create a 1/1 white warrior creature token with vigilance. This is my pick for the best monument. It suffers from the same weaknesses they all suffer from. Not all of your creatures will be white in most scenarios, so you aren't always going to reap all the rewards, but the reward this offers is pretty awesome, the one that it offers to all creatures, and that is that you get to make a 1/1 token every time you play a creature, and that's a big bonus, especially on top of reducing the cost of some of your creatures by 1. Additionally, there are token synergies in this format, so producing tokens has some extra value here. I'm going to give this a C+, with the caveat that you need to have a majority of your creatures be white to really make this good, but it's going to be good in any deck, basically, because that, whenever you cast a creature spell trigger, is very good. Next, we have Oracle's Vault, which for 4 generic mana is an artifact, and you can pay 2 and tap it, and it says exile the top card of your library. Until the end of your turn, you may play that card. Put a brick counter on Oracle's Vault. So another brick counter card here, and the other ability it has is you can tap it, and it says exile the top card of your library. Until end of turn, you may play that card without paying its mana cost. Activate this ability only if there are 3 or more brick counters on Oracle's Vault. This is a cool card and a difficult one to evaluate, I'm going to admit. First, it asks you for a ton of setup and a total investment of 10 mana across 4 turns in most cases. And yes, while you're doing that, you get a tiny bit of value by being able to play the card you reveal, but by paying 2 mana to do the effect, you are risking not being able to cast the card you reveal. Once you get the brick counters on it, it does start drawing you a free card every turn. Free in the sense that you don't have to pay mana for the ability, and you don't have to pay mana for the card either. And once you get to that point, you're just going to win the game because of your massive card and mana advantage. So I hate how much setup this requires, but also realize how powerful the ability is once you get to 3 brick counters. Still, I think because of the setup this card requires and the massive mana investment as well, I'm going to give it a C+. Only decks can force the game long are going to want it, but man are they going to love this card. Next, we have Pyramid of the Pantheon, which for 1 generic mana is an artifact. It has the ability to pay 2 mana and tap itself to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. Put a brick counter on Pyramid of the Pantheon. It can also tap and add 3 mana of any 1 color to your mana pool. Activate this ability only if there are 3 or more brick counters on Pyramid of the Pantheon. This starts out as a very bad Prophetic Prism. Not only do you have to pay 2 mana to filter 1, but it also doesn't draw you a card. Still, this card offers you a source of mana fixing, and if you're in the market for that, it isn't bad. Obviously, once it gets to 3 brick counters, it is insane because it turns into Gilded Lotus, but keep in mind, you've invested 7 total mana in the card across several turns to get it to that point, so you're only really going to be getting ahead after the 3rd activation of its mana. It is going to be hard to get this going in the early game at all because of the fact that you're going to want to be developing your board just so you don't die. Not putting brick counters on this thing, so while you might think this is going to make me ramp really well, it is going to be difficult to achieve that unless your opponent is doing nothing on their first several turns. I think this card is a D+, with the caveat that it probably pushes into the C- range if you're desperate for some fixing. Next, we have Ronus' Monument, which is 3 generic mana for a legendary artifact, and it says green creature spells cost 1 less to cast. It also says whenever you cast a creature spell, target creature you control gets +2/+2 and gains trample until end of turn. This is another monument that is pretty solid. Green is another color that will be creature-based and one that will have very good creatures. There's also some ramp going on in green, especially in blue-green, so I won't hate the idea of getting a little more of that. Additionally, the pump effect it offers is pretty real on a board filled with green monsters. Making your Colossipede into a 7/7 trampler sounds pretty good, but you do need to be running several green creatures for this to be worth it. If you are, though, I think it is another C+. Here we have next Throne of the God Pharaoh, which is 2 generic mana for another legendary artifact. Lots of legendary artifacts in this set. And it says at the beginning of your end step, each opponent loses life equal to the number of tapped creatures you control. This is the kind of card I do not want to see if my opponent is playing a super aggressive deck. This can make aggro decks extra potent, since obviously those decks are going to be turning cards sideways the most. It also works well with Exert, since those creatures have to remain tapped. That said, it is going to be terrible in any deck that isn't aggressive, and even in a deck that is aggressive, playing this instead of a 2-drop on turn 2 isn't ideal. But playing it a little bit later is pretty nice. If you're in an aggro deck and you see this card late, you want it. But if your deck isn't going to be tapping creatures a lot and trying to kill your opponent quickly, this is garbage. I'm going to give it a C to reflect that. Next, we have Watchers of the Dead, which for 2 generic mana is a 2/2 artifact creature, and it has the cat creature type. And it says, exile Watchers of the Dead. Each opponent chooses 2 cards in his or her graveyard and exiles the rest. A colorless 2-mana 2/2 with upside is nice as it can slide into any deck. The upside it has isn't great though, as your opponent gets to choose 2 cards to keep in their yard, and a lot of the times with this card, you're going to want to be able to get rid of 2 specific cards in your opponent's graveyard. That would be a better effect. If your opponent goes Embalm Crazy or has a well-stocked graveyard, it does get better because you take away some of their graveyard value, but they will keep the 2 best cards in their graveyard no matter what you do, and that's not going to be enough. Overall, I give Watchers of the Dead a C. It is mostly just a generic 2-mana 2/2. That does it for artifacts. Now let's move on to lands. First, we have the Bicycle lands. Each of these has 2 land types. They're the ally colors, and each of them also has cycling for 2, and they enter the battlefield tapped. The Bicycle lands are all great sources of fixing, and they also come with the cycling mechanic, which is nice, because if you draw it in the late game and have no need for it, you can just pitch it, helping you avoid mana flooding. There are also, of course, lots of synergies for cycling in this set. I'm not a huge fan of going after fixing ultra early in a format like this. It seems mostly focused on 2 colors, but these are great sources of it if you find yourself wanting to splash, or if you see one of them late and it happens to be in one of your colors. I'm going to collectively give them a B. As I said, you don't want to be first picking them, unless of course they're worth a lot, and maybe you do, but you shouldn't hesitate to take them once it is clear you're splashing. Next, we have Cascading Cataracts, which is a land. It's indestructible. It can tap to add colorless mana to your mana pool, and you can pay 5 to tap it and add 5 mana in any combination of colors to your mana pool. An indestructible land is kind of cool, but it's not going to be relevant in this format, and the fact you can count on it as a source of fixing for any color by the later part of the game isn't bad either. That said, in the early game, it only produces colorless mana, and that can be a liability, especially from a land that doesn't do much else. Still, the fixing it offers in the late game makes me still want to call this card an okay playable, and I am going to give it a C-. Next, we have Cradle of the Accursed, which is a land. It has the Desert subtype, which one card printed in this set cares about, Sheffit Monitor, back in the green set review, so it is occasionally relevant. And it adds Colorless to your mana pool, and you can pay 3 and sacrifice it to make a 2/2 black zombie creature token. Activate this ability only anytime you could cast a sorcery. Lands that actually do things are often underrated, but they are better than they look. This is because they only take up a land slot in your deck while also providing a useful effect, so you're getting more than a card's worth of value out of them. I think Cradle of the Accursed is a good example of that. In the early game, it is a land like any other, though it does only produce colorless mana, but in the late game, it turns into a 2/2 zombie token, and that's pretty solid, especially in a set with a zombie archetype and a token archetype. I'm going to give the Cradle a C. It is a decent land that'll play frequently enough, especially in blue-white and black-white. Next, we have Evolving Wilds, which we've seen a million times, and we're seeing again. It's a land. You can sacrifice it and tap it to search your library for a basic land card and put it on the battlefield tapped. Then shuffle your library. Evolving Wilds is a great source of fixing, especially because this set doesn't have a common cycle of 2-color lands, and because of that, it is very good and worth taking relatively early, especially when packs you're looking at don't have any super impressive cards. I'm going to give Evolving Wilds a B-. Every deck wants at least one of these, even if they are only 2 colors. Next, we have Grasping Dunes. It's another land with the Desert subtype, and you can tap it to add colorless to your mana pool. You can also pay 1 and tap it to sacrifice Grasping Dunes and put a -1/-1 counter on target creature. Activate this ability only anytime you could cast a sorcery. Another desert that does something, Grasping Dunes has a solid effect, allowing you to put a -1/-1 counter on one of your opponent's creatures. You only have to spend 1 mana for it too, which is a good cost. It isn't the most impactful thing, just like Cradle of the Accursed wasn't, but when it is tacked on to a card that produces mana for several turns, it's pretty reasonable, especially in a format with an archetype focused on -1/-1 counters. I'm going to give this a C. Next, we have Painted Bluffs, which is another land with the Desert subtype, and you can tap it and add colorless to your mana pool. You can pay 1 and tap it to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. This desert doesn't have any late game utility like the others. Instead, though, it helps you filter and fix mana. You'd rather have Evolving Wilds to help you fix, but if you're not green, Painted Bluffs is an okay alternative if you can't pick those up. I still think it's a D+ in most decks, but because there are several better routes to fixing, but if you're desperate for fixing, it becomes a little bit better than that. And our final card in this limited review is Sun-Scorched Desert, which is a land with the desert subtype, and it says when Sun-Scorched Desert enters the battlefield, it deals 1 damage to target player. You can tap it and add 1 colorless to your mana pool. For some reason, they printed this desert after several deserts that are at least fairly playable. It's pretty bad. The other deserts all do something useful for you. This one really doesn't. Doing 1 damage to your opponent is not a reason to play this card. You should never play this card. It's a liability because it only produces colorless, and the effect it gives you is basically irrelevant, so that gives it an F. Well, I've now graded every single card in Amonkhet. While the full set review is over, I will be putting out an archetype guide later this week where I will discuss what each of the color pairs is trying to do in the format. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it. In the comments, let me know what you think of this format and the grades that I gave these cards. If you disagree, we should talk about it. It'll help us both get better at Limited. If you want to make sure you catch future Limited reviews and a bunch of other Limited content, don't forget to subscribe. My content is also sponsored in part by 5colorcombo.com, a great website for all things Magic. If you like drafting, and I'm assuming you do since you just sat through this whole video, they even have an app that lets you practice drafting wherever you go. Thanks for watching.